have heard the Supreme Court's crucial verdict on Waqf Act. SC has stayed sections of the Waqf Act, but it has refused to stay the Waqf Amendment Act in its entirety. Go on and tell us, how big is this verdict to begin with?
No, it's of course, a big verdict by the Supreme Court. And I think it's in a very balanced judgment which has come out today. So the Supreme Court has basically relied on a very established constitutional provision that there is a presumption in favor of a statute which has been passed by the parliament, unless on the face of it, it is shown that the entire act itself is unconstitutional. So the Supreme Court therefore has not stayed the entire act, but the Supreme Court has called out certain specific provisions in the Amendment Act which were challenged by the different parties. And the Supreme Court had stayed all such contentious provisions unless the government frames the rule clarifying the legislative position. And therefore, the Supreme Court has called out that there were primarily three very contentious provisions in the Amendment Act which were challenged by the different party. One, as you rightly said, was that any person who wants to make a donations to the Waqf property has to be a practitioner Muslim for 5 years. So the question was that who will determine who is a practitioner Muslim for 5 years? Where is the mechanism to determine? Where is the structure to determine who would be the person who will take that call, that whether you have been a practicing Muslim for 5 years or not? So I believe when during the argument in the court, the central government were not clearly able to establish the bona fide of this provision, that which put an onus on the person who is making the donations to the Waqf property, establishing that he or she is the practicing Muslim for 5 years. Therefore, that provision has been stayed by the Supreme Court. Again, there was another very contentious provision in the Act which relates to the power of the state government through the district magistrate to determine the status of the Waqf property, that whether a property is a Waqf property or not. And the related provisions was that while this determination is going on, until the final order does not come, the property will lose its status as a Waqf property. The Supreme Court has called out these two specific provisions, saying that it violates the fundamental principle of natural justice, where the adjudicator, which is the state government, is also the interested party. So there is an established principle of law that nobody can be the judge in his or her own case. So the Supreme Court said that it strikes at the provisions of the separation of power, where the state government is also the litigating party and the state government's officer, district magistrate, is also the adjudicating the officer. And therefore, the Supreme Court strikes it, saying that this provision seems to be unconstitutional because it strikes at the very principle of separation of power. And the second related provision for this was that till this adjudication process is pending and the final order comes in, the status of the Waqf property will lose its status as being the Waqf property. So the Supreme Court said that you are putting the cart before the horse, and therefore it is not allowed. Till the order comes, the Waqf property will have the status of the Waqf property. So in my view, these two the parts where the major controversy has been stayed by the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court has also talked about the constitution of the Waqf board, because again, there was a provision where the non-Muslims were given the majority in the constitution of the Waqf board. Supreme Court has by now stayed that provision, and put a limit, as you were explaining, that the 4 non-Muslim and the 3 from the state cannot be more than that. And the ex officio or chairman also or head also the Supreme Court in relations to that provision has also stayed the provision unless the rules are framed by the state. So
Mr.
in my
Mishra,
view,
okay,
yes.
Mr. Mishra, let me ask you this. Legally speaking, does this partial stay weaken the central government's case for the Amendment Act, or is it just, sort of an interim balancing act?
No, I will not look at it from the weaken and strengthening standpoint of view. As a lawyer, what I see is that whether our constitutional principles have been upheld in this judgment or not. And in my view, the Supreme Court has passed a very balanced order. Because if the Supreme Court would have stayed the entire act, dehorse any provisions or all the provisions, it would have been that the entire act itself has been stayed as if there is no provision which stands the scrutiny of the law. Therefore, the Supreme Court has reiterated the principles, the established principles, that there is an assumption in favor of the constitutionality of an statute which has been passed by the parliament. But the Supreme Court had said that within that constitutionality, the court is empowered to look into specific provisions which has been challenged being unlawful or unconstitutional. And therefore, the Supreme Court has pointed out the specific provisions which were basically called out for by the petitioner, that these specific provisions violate the very fundamental structure of Waqf property and Waqf board. And therefore, the Supreme Court has said that we understand where the basic disagreement was, and then Supreme Court has dealt with those provisions specifically and state those provisions. So in that sense, yes, if you look at from that perspective, of course, the stand of the central government has weakened to quite an extent by this judgment, because these very contentious provisions have been stayed by the Supreme Court, which the Waqf people were arguing takes away the administration of the Waqf property from the Waqf board and vested into the hand of government, and secondly, strikes at the very character of Waqf property, and also strikes at the right of every Muslim, irrespective of how long he or she is professing the faith, to make the donations to the Waqf property. And these 3 major challenges were argued in the Supreme Court, and ultimately the Supreme Court has stated that provisions. So of course it has weakened the central government's position, because central government was not ready to give concessions on any of such provisions, and vehemently argued before the court that these provisions are very constitutional.
All right, continue to stay with us, Mr. Mishra. In fact, we're also getting some reactions from Supreme Court. Let's quickly take a listen.
मुसलमान होना चाहिए 5 साल के लिए, उस प्रोविज़न पे स्टे है। साथ ही साथ कि जो सेक्शन प्रोविज़ो 3C का है, उसमें कहा गया है कि जो प्रॉपर्टी हैं उनको जब तक कि ट्राइब्यूनल का डिटर्मिनेशन हाई कोर्ट के साथ नहीं हो जाता है, तब तक उसमें वो स्टे रहेगा, उनको डिस्पोजेस नहीं किया जाएगा, कोई थर्ड पार्टी इंटरेस्ट नहीं क्रिएट होगा। सेक्शन 9 में कहा है कि नॉट मोर देन 4 नॉन मेंबर्स विल बी नॉन मुस्लिम, और सेक्शन 23 में कहा है कि 3 out of 11 इन बोर्ड विल नॉट मोर देन 3 विल बी नॉन मुस्लिम्स। सेक्शन 23 को स्टे नहीं किया गया है, लेकिन ये कहा गया है कि ऑल एफर्ट शुड बी मेड टू अपॉइंट CEO फ्रॉम द मुस्लिम कम्युनिटी। बाकी ये बड़ा लंबा जजमेंट लिखा है, इसकी स्टडी करनी पड़ेगी और उस पर फिर ज़्यादा अच्छे से हम बता सकेंगे।
ये बहुत अच्छा फैसला है, और सरकार की साजिश और सरकार की मंशा पर माननीय उच्चतम न्यायालय ने बड़े पैमाने पर रोक लगा दी है, अंकुश लगा दी है। तो पूरे देश में अपनी ज़मीनें दान करने वाले लोग, धार्मिक कामों के लिए, सामाजिक कामों के लिए, जिनको ये डर था कि सरकार उनकी ज़मीनें लूटने की कोशिश करेगी, फौरी तौर पर उनको बहुत बड़ी राहत मिली। आप कैसे तय करोगे कि कौन 5 साल से प्रैक्टिस कर रहा है? ये तो आस्था का विषय है, ये तो अंतर्मन की बात है। तो माननीय उच्चतम न्यायालय ने इन तमाम संवेदनात्मक पहलुओं को और छोटे छोटे पहलुओं को देखा है। तो मैं बहुत खुश हूं और मुझे अच्छा लग रहा है। एक बहुत बड़ी लड़ाई है इस देश में वक्फ की जमीनों को बचाने की, हम उस लड़ाई को लड़ते रहेंगे।
The Honorable Supreme Court has made very categorical interim order today. Number one, there is no stay on the amendments brought in by the central government headed by Manniya Narendra Modi ji. So there is no stay on the amendments.